I am delighted to welcome you to today's talk on the Lansdowne House drawing room. My name is Linnea West. I work in public programs here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And as we spend time today in one of the galleries in our main building, I want to note that we are located in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. A history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the walking purchase of 1737, displaced many Lenape from this land. The museum and its staff strive to to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to Lenape people and their vibrant communities today, including the federally recognized nations, Delaware Tribe, Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to Lenape ancestors past and present by committing to build a more equitable and inclusive space for all. Today we are joined by Alisa Chiles and Tara Contractor, who will be joining us live from the gallery, from the Lansdowne House drawing room itself. Alisa Chiles is Assistant Curator of European Decorative Arts here at the museum, and Tara Contractor is Assistant Curator of European Painting and Sculpture. Together, they will be speaking to us from the Lansdowne room, which is newly reopened to the public. I hope you will all consider this virtual program an invitation to visit and rediscover the gallery the next time you are at the museum. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping notes. The chat is open. Please feel free to say hello there, to share where you're tuning in from. We're delighted to have you with us. We are saving time at the end for Q&A. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And those are the questions that we will be reading from at the end. There's a helpful upvote feature. So if you see a question that you like and you want to hear it answered, you can give it a thumbs up and it'll go to the top of the queue. And those are the questions we'll get to first. The program is closed captioned. You can click the CC button in your Zoom toolbar to turn those on or off. And finally, we are recording today's program, and we're going to send out a follow-up email tomorrow. It'll include a link to the recording, so you can look back on anything we share today. With all that said, Alisa and Tara, I'm happy to turn this program over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Alisa Chiles.
And I'm Tara Contractor.
And we're delighted that you could join us today. We're here on the third floor of the museum in the galleries devoted to British art. And we're going to be taking you through our newly reconfigured Lansdowne drawing room, which was designed by Robert Adam in the 18th century. This is one of the museum's most important and splendid period rooms, and it has recently undergone a big transformation with the addition of a carpet, which was made according to Robert Adams' original designs from the 1760s. This has been a project which has been many years in the making and has involved a large number of staff here at the museum. So we're very excited to show you this space for a couple of reasons. One, that now you can finally see Robert Adams' vision for the room in its entirety. But it also is going to be the first time that you'll be able to physically enter the space in decades. Previously, there were barricades at either of the entrances, and so you could only come to the doorways and peer inside. So we're going to head back to London in the 1760s.
And now that we can walk inside the room, let's take a minute to do just that and pan around so that you can get a sense of what it is that makes this space so special before we get talking about the history.
Great. So if we could please go to the first PowerPoint slide. So this room comes from Lansdowne House. The house is located in central London, and it was quite distinctive in the 1760s when it was built because of its great size. It was noted to be a palace by contemporaries, by people who saw it. And you can see here sort of a grand stately home, excuse me, with a rather stately facade or front face. It also had a garden that was enclosed by a wall, which was really unique to have in London at the time. And it was later described by one architectural historian as really a country house in the city. Excuse me. So it was a very distinctive, unique residence in the 18th century. And you can see on the modern map on the right exactly where it's located in London. It was on the corner of Berkeley Square in the Mayfair neighborhood, and it's close to Buckingham Palace. So it's really in central London. And if we could please go to the next slide. Here you see what the house looked like in the 1920s, shortly before the front part of the house was actually removed, and the drawing room was disassembled and shipped to the United States. At the time, the City of London was building a new street near Berkeley Square, which would necessitate the demolition of part of Lansdowne House. And the director of the Philadelphia Museum at the time, Fisk Kimball, learned about this and reached out and arranged for the museum to purchase the drawing room, which was then carefully disassembled. It was all of the architectural elements in the room were sawn into easily transportable pieces. It was shipped in about 114 crates to Philadelphia, where it was very carefully reassembled here in the museum in a process that took more than a decade to complete. And it was not all uncommon at the time in the early 20th century to ship entire rooms from Europe to the United States. There are many rooms in museum collections that came from Europe at this time, and they were also used to furnish people's private homes. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art also has a room from Lansdowne House. They have the dining room, which came to them at around the same time. And the drawing room here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the dining room at the Met are actually the only two houses designed by Robert Adam in the United States. So it's really special that we have this room here at the PMA. And if we could please go to the next slide. Here you see what Lansdowne House looks like today in busy, bustling London. It's now a private club, which opened in 1935. And you can see the facade here has been radically reconfigured, and many of the interior spaces have also undergone renovations and changes as well. And if we can go to the next slide, please.
Great, so we can think a little bit more, I think we can dive into the 1760s context of the room and explore who its original owners were. So the first owner of the house for whom it was designed is John Stuart, the third Earl of Bute. He's a very unpopular Scottish politician who was the tutor to George III when he was still the Prince of Wales. He rises in stature, but in part he's very unpopular because he's Scottish, and 18th century xenophobia, that's the way it works. And he's also very unpopular because of the way he resolves the 7 Years' War, otherwise known as the French and Indian War. He's the prime minister who is in charge of that set of treaties, and he negotiates a deal that sets up British power in the Caribbean, but a lot of people feel that he could have gone further, been more aggressive, and that ends his political career, makes him very anxious to get out of London in a hurry. So he sells the house in 1765 to William Petty Fitzmaurice, who is the second Earl of Shelburne. He later becomes the Marquess of Lansdowne, which is what gives the house its name, Lansdowne House. He is another very unpopular Scottish politician for similar reasons. There is kind of an interesting circle of Scotsmen moving around Adam, so that's something to think about as we move through the room. But Shelburne is most notable for being the politician who is negotiating the end of the American Revolutionary War. So he is very close with a lot of the American founding fathers. He entertains Benjamin Franklin in Lansdowne House, and he corresponds with George Washington, and he is generally very supportive of the American cause.
So we can actually come back to us now in the room and stop the PowerPoint. So what's really special about this room and about Lansdowne House is that it's designed by Robert Adam, who is one of the most important and prolific architects in British history. He was enormously popular in 18th century Britain. If you had a home in the English countryside or a townhouse in London, then you wanted Robert Adam to come and work for you. Most of the work that he did actually was redesigning interiors of buildings that already existed. And he had a tendency, I should say, to steal commissions from some of his rivals. He would often go to an aristocratic owner of an estate and say, I know you're working with this particular architect. You really shouldn't work with them, work with me instead. And I have to say he was quite successful in getting commissions this way. He was a very shrewd businessman. As Tara mentioned, he was Scottish and used that to his advantage to cultivate a whole circle of patrons. He came from a family of architects. His father had been the most important architect working in Scotland in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And he went into business practice with his younger brother, James. He was also very talented at promoting himself and marketing himself. With his brother, he published a 3-volume book of describing all of his work and his kind of thinking about architecture, which was kind of meant to be an advertisement and to entice clients. At the beginning of this series of publications, he wrote that he had started a revolution in architecture. This is quite a bold statement, but it is quite true that Robert Adam really did usher in a whole new modern era in British architectural history. He's actually only the second European architect in history, the first being the Italian 16th century architect Andrea Palladio, to have a style named after him. Today we call it the Adam style. In the 18th century, it was known as the Adamitic mode. And important to his style and to everything that he did really was the way in which he took inspiration from the art and architecture of ancient Rome and Greece. And he was a pioneer of neoclassicism in this way. Neoclassicism being a revival of the subject matter and the art and architecture of the classical world. Of course, everyone was interested in classical antiquity at this moment. This was in part because there were new archaeological discoveries that were happening with excavations in places like Herculaneum and Pompeii, beginning in the 1730s and continuing into the 18th century. Adam knew about these. He also went on the Grand Tour in the 1850s, which was a kind of educational rite of passage for young men who came from wealthy families, in which he would travel through Europe and head to Italy to learn firsthand about the art and architecture of the classical world. What was really special about Adam's experience was that he met Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who is the Italian artist most famous for his etchings of classical ruins. And Piranesi actually showed Adam things in Rome that many other grand tourists, as they were called, didn't have access to. And Adam also learned how to draw while he was on the grand tour, and he documented a lot of these ancient sites. And he returned to these drawings many times throughout his career for inspiration. And he so loved Rome, especially, that he later was sort of known by a nickname, Bob the Roman.
My favorite. But to speak to Adam and his close ties with artists at the time, as well as these archaeological interests that Alisa mentioned, we're lucky enough to have in the room a suite of paintings that were designed for Lansdowne House, designed to be in an Adam interior, though they were originally in an adjacent room. And those are these paintings by Giovanni Battista Cipriani, which are above the doors here. And they are very closely based on ancient frescoes, which the artist and Adam were familiar with in Herculaneum. The suite here depicts scenes from the life of Achilles, the mythic hero of the Trojan War, going from his early youth through to the end of the Iliad. And it's very fun to have these pictures with a child and a centaur here, because Lord Shelburne's family crest had a centaur in it, so there's probably a little bit of an illusion there. But in any case, those are key part of the neoclassicism of the room, as are all of the very beautiful winding patterns, or as we call them, arabesques, that are moving all around the room, the walls and the ceiling. So if we can look at the ceiling here, you'll see all of the patterns that are designed by Adam and executed by Antonio Zucchi, executed with a great deal of flair. If you come into the room and you look at them closely, you'll see that there's a lovely, almost soap bubble sheen to the colors that are being chosen. They are constantly moving, never repeating themselves exactly. That's very beautiful. And Cipriani, who did the paintings of Achilles, also did the central painting and the semicircular vignettes around it. The central painting depicts Jupiter and Mercury and Venus all together, and all around them are different myths about the ocean, which speak very tellingly, I think, to Britain's sense of itself in this period as a maritime power. So a lot of interesting thinking about what it means to be an empire in the 18th century, what it meant to be an empire in the classical world. I think that's very much part of the context for this space.
And so another really distinguishing element of Robert Adams' style, in addition to his neoclassicism and the way in which he's drawing inspiration directly from antique sources, is what you can see all throughout the room here is a kind of lightness and delicacy and elegance to the ornaments and to the architectural elements. So you see it in the ceiling, you also see it in architectural elements like this here. This is a pilaster, which is a rectangular column that's embedded into the wall, and these are used throughout the space. But you can see in the space, these and the other elements are all sort of used symmetrically, and they're balanced, which would have been true of other architecture in Britain in the 18th century, which we call Georgian, because there were a lot of kings in England at the time named George. But unlike much Georgian architecture, which tended to be heavier and more robust and to have sort of bolder architectural details, Adam's use of things like pilasters are much lighter and more delicate. You can see that the thickness of this, that it's quite thin, so it becomes kind of flat, in the room. So this is quite distinctive. Another thing too, when you look around the room, Adam, he talked a lot about wanting to bring movement into architecture. And so, it's so elegant and graceful and beautiful, but as your eye travels around this room, you can see that there are actually subtle variations between flatness and depth, and that's intentional. And Adam also wanted to make sure that there was a variety of patterns and decorations and things that you would see in the room, and not only in each room, but also as you move through an entire house or building. This was meant to continue this kind of variety and delight in what you were seeing. And so Adam, this is very distinctive to him as well, he really thought about the design in a very cohesive, unified way. So everything in an Adam space was meant to be in harmony with every other element of a room. And so to do this, he really thought about every detail in a space. He thought about the walls, the ceilings, the floors and carpets, but also the furniture, the mirrors, the hardware for the doors. So here you can see this is a great example here. You can look at the hardware on these beautiful mahogany doors that Adam designed. And so he thought about everything, every detail. And when you hired him, he gave you everything. He was one of the first architects really to do this, to design every element of the room, which of course was also very financially lucrative for him, because when you're designing so many things that would require drawings that you would have to show your clients, and he would charge a fee for each drawing. So this was very good business practice for him as well.
And to say a little more about this effect of lightness and elegance that this has drawn out so beautifully, I think a key part of how we achieve this, and something I'm sure you're all noticing about the room, is it has this very unique color palette of these beautiful light blues and pinks. And a question that we get all the time when we give tours of the space is, are these the original colors? And the answer is, in fact, yes. When the room arrived at the museum, it arrived with beige paint over all of this. And then when the room was conserved in the 1980s, we found these colors underneath, and then were able to do a conservation treatment that recreated them for everyone to enjoy today. These are colors that very much speak to 18th century fashions and 18th century color theory. So when Adam was looking at ancient villas in ancient Rome, those would have had a much darker color palette, a tendency towards rich earthy reds and deep cerulean blues. But here he is very much using the color palette in his own day, the kind of things that you might see in a lady's dress, in a gentleman's waistcoat. This is a kind of color theory that's very influenced by a writer Burke, who pioneers a theory of the beautiful and the sublime as opposing ideas. This is the kind of colors that he associated with the beautiful. So this is a sense that the light colors are going to be the most restful. The sublime are going to be the darker colors that give you a sense of fear and terror. Maybe not the kind of thing you want after dinner when you're having drinks with your friends. So it's very fitting that these lighter colors were chosen for this space, which is meant to be light, social, elegant, a space for entertaining.
And so again, the color was very important in creating the overall unified effect in the room. And as I mentioned, Adam was thinking about all of the surfaces. He usually started actually with the ceiling when he was designing the space, and then you think about the walls, but the floors were also always very important in an Adam design. And so here we're looking at this new recreation of the carpet that Adam designed in the 1760s. And the staff at the museum was aware, was knowledgeable that Adam had made two drawings for a carpet to go into the room in the 1760s. These drawings are now preserved in the collection of the Johnstone Museum in London. Johnstone himself was a very well-known, famous architect working in Britain. He's best known for the Bank of England. And he actually ended up purchasing about 9,000 drawings that came from Robert Adams' practice. So there are a lot of drawings that Robert Adam and his brother James and other draftsmen working for them made that are part of the Soane Museum's collection, including drawings for this carpet here. And the staff here had long sought a way to try to recreate Adam's original design for the carpet in this space. And it wasn't until recent technological advances in the museum and heritage field took place that we were finally able to do that. And so we worked with a company that's based in the United Kingdom, which specializes in making very realistic replicas of carpets. They also make replicas of wooden floors and stone floors as well, in order to protect floors or protect historic carpets. They've done work all over the UK in various private estates and properties managed by the National Trust. And the way that they work is to start by taking a very high resolution image of the carpet that they're going to replicate in order to get all of the texture and detail of the carpet to show the weaving patterns of the carpet. And then they print that image onto a special floor covering that they create, which has a knitted polyester surface on top so that it sort of feels a little bit like a carpet. And then that on the back side has a rubber backing. So we kind of joke that it's sort of like a giant mouse pad. And you can see, you can actually see some seams here on the floor if you look close. This special floor covering, they actually fabricate it in tiles, which they then stitch together to create a whole design. But this project actually presented a very unique challenge for this company because they're used to replicating carpets that exist. And in this case, the carpet was never actually created. So it was sort of a special process of working with the two drawings that are at the PhilaMuseum, which help us to understand Robert Adams' design and also the colors that he intended in the carpet. And then we used a high resolution image of a carpet that Adam designed from around the same time, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection, in order to get the high resolution detail of the weaving patterns that the company needed to recreate this. And so here you see the results. And what's really important to kind of notice is that you can see that there's sort of composition of different geometrical forms in this carpet. So in the center, there's a square with a rosette. There are 4 segmental lunettes that surround this. Vitruvian scroll, gold and red, and then you have these 4 diamond lozenges on either end. And when you look up at the ceiling, you'll actually see that this exact geometrical design is echoed in the ceiling itself. And so again, this is very distinctive of what Adam would do in a lot of his homes, that he would actually make sure that, not that they were the exact same, but that the floor and the ceiling mirrored each other and were in dialogue with each other. And the colors in the carpet are also meant to enhance this effect. So the blues and the greens and the reds and browns are all meant to speak to all of the colors and surfaces that you see in the room. The yellow and brown in the carpet, is in dialogue with the gilding that you see throughout the room. So we're so excited to see this and experience this now, because you can really get a sense of the intended effect that Adam had when he came into this space. And you can see how an Adam interior was intended to work with all of the surfaces working in harmony and being in dialogue with each other. Now, the furniture and furnishings in an Adam room were also meant to add to this cohesive, unified effect. We know that in the 18th century, he worked with the very best makers during the day, people including Matthew Bolton, who worked in fine metalwork, Thomas Chippendale, one of the greatest English furniture makers in history, Josiah Wedgwood, who was a pioneer in ceramics at the time. And we know that these artists worked on pieces for Lansdowne House. Now, none of the furniture that you see in the space now is original to Lansdowne House. Over the course of the lifetime of the house, the furniture and the art collection was sold and dispersed, with one of the first sales happening in 1805 and 1806. Lord Shelburne's son actually sold a great number of things from the house. But we have decided to furnish this gallery here with works by 18th century artists that kind of give you a sense of what you would have seen in a space like this and what you would have seen in an 18th century stately home. And so the furniture suite, here you can see a chair from that suite. Is also a settee and benches and 2 fire screens. This was commissioned by another Scotsman, actually named Sir Lawrence Dundas, who asked Robert Adam to come and help redesign his estate in called Moor Park, which is in Hertfordshire, which Adam worked on. And Dundas was also kind of an interesting figure. He was enormously wealthy, and much of his wealth came from various mercantile ventures, what could sort of politely be described as arms dealing during the 7 Years' War, but also from exploiting the labor of enslaved African people on plantations that he owned in the West Indies. And the furniture that we see here was actually originally covered with tapestries that were made at the Gobelin, which was a very famous weaving manufactory in Paris. And then the easel paintings as well.
Yeah, as Alisa mentioned, the original paintings collections were mostly sold, unfortunately, though at one point bought back by a grandson and then sold again. So with the exception of the Ciprianis, the paintings that we have in the room are not original to Lansdowne House, but we have taken efforts to install paintings that are in keeping with the kinds of things that Butte and Shelburne collected. Both of them were avid collectors in the same way that most gentlemen of their elite set were, and it's a fashionable thing to do at the time. They generally collected a lot of 17th century Dutch pictures, a smattering of Italian pictures, some depicting mythological scenes, some depicting biblical scenes. Every now and then they would buy a picture by one of their contemporaries, but it's more fashionable to be collecting those kinds of continental works, mostly genre painting and landscape and kind of this mythological scenes that I mentioned. So if you come in, you'll get a real flavor for the kinds of paintings that were on view in a country house of the period.
And then another aspect of the room that we wanted to point out is this recessed niche here, this recessed alcove. And this was actually designed for Lord Butte's mechanical organ, which was supposed to be coming to Lansdowne House. It actually is quite typical of something that Robert Adam would do in a lot of his rooms if he had a very large object like an organ, for example, but also sculpture. He tended to create recessed spaces or niches for them when he was thinking about composing space. Lord Bute was he's a very interesting person. He loved botany and actually made a lot of important contributions to the field of botany. He published about botany. He was instrumental in creating Kew Gardens in London or in Britain. He also loved literature and the arts, and he really loved music. So in the early 1760s, when he commissioned Robert Adam to build Lansdowne House for him, at the same time, he was having an enormously expensive mechanical organ constructed. And this was really, it had cutting edge technology. He spared no expense to have it made. And it was kind of meant to be like a clockwork device that would work like a piano player. So you could program it with various pieces of music that you liked. We know this organ had works by Vivaldi and Handel and many others. And so he was working on having this constructed. And we also know that Robert Adam designed a case for the organ. There's a drawing for it in the Soane Museum. And of course, Lord Bute had a pretty disastrous run as prime minister. He ended up being hated on both sides of the Atlantic, in fact. He was attacked verbally and sometimes not just verbally. And the 18th century expression Jack Boot, which at the time meant, in a polite way, a person of low intelligence, was a direct reference to him and his time as prime minister. So he ended up kind of leaving London. He never lived in Lansdowne House. And he went to Luton Hoo, which was an estate that he purchased in the countryside, which he also had asked Robert Adam to work on for him. And so we know that the organ never came to Lansdowne House, and it actually went directly to Luton Hoo, where Lord Bute was living. And then near the end of Lord Bute's life, he actually decided that he needed more time by the sea, and he needed more fresh air. And so he ended up spending a lot of time by the seaside in a castle that he built called Highcliffe. And apparently he loved this organ so much that he asked whether the organ could go with him to this new residence, and evidently was told that that wouldn't be possible. So what he decided to do was to construct an entirely new organ. So he had a second organ made, which went into his residence in Highcliffe. And this organ was actually more technologically advanced than the first. It weighed a lot less. It had a better winding efficiency so that you wouldn't have to send a servant in quite as frequently to wind it up so that it would play music on its own. A lot of new advances in organ technology took place with the design of the second organ. We've also seen in records that a nearby church near Bute's residence also, shortly after he arrived, but a year after he arrived, also got one of these organs. And so it seems quite clear that it was Lord Bute who suggested his local church get one as well. So he loved his music.
Unfortunately, Lord Bute, who as we know, never got to listen to music in the room. He never got to have the grand parties that he imagined. But Lansdowne did have a very exciting, glittering history as a scene for entertaining. So in the 18th century, as we mentioned earlier, Lord Shelburne is entertaining some of his political allies, including Benjamin Franklin, as well as a set of all of the greatest on the London scene at the time. So David Garrick, the actor, is there, Honoré Villot, the French philosopher is there as well. If you were anyone, you were in Lansdowne House. And this reputation continues into the 19th century. It very much is a hub for the Whig Party, which is the kind of, liberal branch of the British government at the time. It is somewhere that poets are coming. It becomes something of a literary salon. Lord Byron comes, though he is not very impressed with the parties here, because I think they were a little bit too tame for him. Into the 19th century, when Parliament burns, this becomes a place where the House of Lords, which session is it? It's it's used for meetings.
It's a Privy Council.
Privy Council, that's what it is.
Privy Council, just sort of the elite group of Parliament.
Yeah, so when the Parliament burns, they meet here, and that's very exciting as well. Moving into the later 19th century, Charles Dickens is here, Henry James is here at the end. A very exciting moment in the history of Lansdowne House actually happens in the 20th century when it is rented for a time by Henry Selfridge, who is an American business magnate who found Selfridge's department store in London. He hosts wild parties in the room in the 1920s. He invites the Aga Khan and Isidore Duncan, and he's known for lavish entertaining on a grand scale with champagne and dancing and jazz bands. So as we're thinking about that history of the room, we do like to imagine that maybe people were in here dancing the Charleston right before the crash came. So that is I know, a fun later history of the room.
Yeah, so it has this kind of Gatsby-esque moment, really embodying the Roaring 20s. But with that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience.
Thank you all so much. That was really wonderful. It was great to be walked through the history of the room and to just see what a beautiful room it is now. For everyone out there, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to hear your questions now. If you can put them in the Q&A box, we will read them from there. And in fact, my colleague Greg Stewart is in the room, and he will be helping relay the questions to our speakers.
Hello, I've been here the whole time. And I think we figured out in the interim that our microphones are not working and it's all coming from the camera. So I'm gonna try to speak towards the camera so you can hear me. And I would ask that our speakers do the same to try to help with audio issues.
Oh my goodness.
They were working right before we started, of course. So we have a number of questions that are specifically about why this came to the museum. And we talked a little bit about, this Kimball and the state of but I wondered if you want to just elaborate a little bit on how it was just like this room, like all of that stuff.
So, the Philadelphia Museum of Art was actually founded in 1876, and the original building was in Fairmount Park. And so in the early 20th century, it actually was about a 14-year design period with a number of different Philadelphia-based architects. We had the new building where the museum is now was constructed, and it was completed in 1928. And at the time, the director of the museum, who was a heroic architectural historian named Fisk Kimball, was thinking about what would go into this new building on the Parkway and how specifically he could create context for works of art to be seen. So he really wanted the extraordinary collection here to have settings that really evoked the period in which these works were made. And so he was beginning to identify rooms that represented American history, but also he's very interested in British history. So looking for British rooms that might be able to come to the museum and to really fulfill this kind of goal that he had for display and context. And so it was around 1924, actually, that the neighborhood where Lansdowne House was beginning to change quite a lot. There was a grand house nearby where the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire actually lived. And in 1924, that house had been transitioned to become a series of apartments. The Lansdowne House itself was in the family of Lord Shelburne from the 1760s all the way up until 1929, when one of Lord Shelburne's heirs decided to sell the house to a group of investors. And they actually had hoped to build a high-rise tower, which the City of London prohibited. But Fitz-Kimball was aware of what was happening in the neighborhood. He knew about the historical significance of Lansdowne House, and of course, the importance of Robert Adam and his contributions to British art and architecture. And so when he learned that part of the house was going to be demolished, actually in the early 1930s, he immediately reached out and asked to have one of the rooms that was going to be destroyed come to the museum. And he was in contact with colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and that's how they also came to get the dining room. And so that's how it ended up coming to the museum, and that was really the reason why. And it was this suite of rooms. We're on the third floor, and we have a number of rooms, for example, from House Sutton Scarsdale Hall, Wrightington Hall, and this whole series of rooms. These were some of the first rooms to be installed in this new museum building on the Parkway in the 1920s. So.
And I think it's also worth adding that the 20s are a time when Georgian, late 18th century British painting is the most expensive painting in the world. Romney paintings are reaching sky-high prices at auction at that time. This is very much the kind of art that's extremely trendy with collectors, in kind of the same way that we might think of Impressionist paintings reaching those kind of stellar heights at auction today. So it's very much in keeping with tastes of that era that this was such a priority at the time.
We have some other questions too. I'm trying to summarize a few here that are about kind of the relationship of the interior that we're seeing to the exterior of the house, and the Adam's design for the exterior as well, and how this fit together. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, Adam, as I mentioned, he didn't actually design that many houses from the ground up. The Lansdowne House is kind of an exception. So there aren't a lot of examples of this sort of built exteriors that we can look at, but I think the intention, as you see in one of those early slides, showing the house was to really, you can see that it's very classicizing in its proportions and the use of this grand sort of portico, Ionic columns. So he's definitely looking to classical precedents to help him with that. One of the things that he was really adamant about and wrote a lot about in terms of how he was inspired by antiquity was that he made a point that he never wanted to copy it exactly. He wanted to look at it, he wanted to understand Roman building, he wanted to understand proportions and systems, methods of building, but he really aimed to infuse his own imagination into what he was doing, and to really, in a way, kind of surpass and rival, this is kind of how he described it, the achievements of antiquity. And so you can see in his built exterior, he's not copying anything exactly, but he's definitely drawing from classicizing architectural traditions. There are some other examples that we have of his work, where sometimes he's copying, or he's drawing, you can see more direct references to things that inspired him in antiquity. There's one building where he makes an update to the exterior and actually copies the Arch of Constantine sort of directly for the portico. But the exterior of Lansdowne House is rather stately and grandeur. And when you come inside, you see this kind of levity, you see this use of color, you see all of the interesting kind of architectural elements that he's combining that really are distinctive to him. And so, you know, the elements in this room, the color, as I mentioned, the lightness of the ornament, these all really scream Robert Adam. And you see spaces in many other estates across the United Kingdom that have similarities to it. But he wanted, and some, not all of the rooms that he designed were sort of as colorful. Some of them could have more subdued colors. And as I mentioned, different rooms were used for different purposes in homes. They were meant to have different ambiances or environments. Perhaps in the PowerPoint, we could go to the slide showing the dining room from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which you'll see has sort of much more subtle colors. It's kind of a gray color with a greenish tint. Adam wrote about, dining rooms, the purpose of dining rooms, and the fact that, for example, you shouldn't use fabrics on the walls or anything that would catch smells while people were dining. Also, there was a lot of sometimes heated political conversation that would happen over dinner, and so wanting to use colors that were cooler and calming. So even in an Adam space, you'll see the subtle changes from room to room and how he's thinking about the color and the composition of different elements.
Great. We also have, and again, I'm summarizing some questions here.
Thank you.
We have some questions about the restoration that happened in the 1970s, including from our very own Ines Shoemaker, curator and caretaker. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that and how that kind of transformed the space.
So, there was some water damage. There was a leak in the building in the 1970s, and that kind of spurred an enormous conservation effort beginning in 1979. Part of what had to happen was just to stabilize the ceiling. As a result of the conservation project in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were some new discoveries made. And actually, Kimball, I should say, when the room came to the museum in 1928, he was aware that, as Tara mentioned, it was covered, the walls were covered with a kind of yellow gold colored silk damask fabric. And Kimball knew that that was not original to the room in the 18th century. He knew that the walls had been painted, but he actually was interested in trying to preserve the fabric for as long as he could. And the fabric started to give out in the 1940s, and he made the decision to paint the walls a kind of neutral tan color, because I think as early as 1928, they were doing paint scrapings to try to determine the colors in the 1940s as well. But the technology was not great enough to be able to determine. And it was very challenging for the conservators to determine what the original paint color was, because this room, of course, was hundreds of years old, and it had been repainted numerous times. There were different parts of the room that had been repainted more times than other parts of the room. And so it took a lot of samples and a lot of scientific analysis, going through layers of paint and layers of dust and dirt, which showed the age of the house, to really determine what the actual original colors were. And in the end, I think the conservators had to take about 300 samples from literally every part of the room to really uncover what Adam's original scheme was. And while they were doing the scientific analysis, there was also new scholarship that was happening. And so the curators and outside scholars also were doing research. And of course, the kind of beigey neutral color was not consistent with what scholars knew Adam tended to use as his color scheme in rooms like this. And in receipts, invoices for the work that the various artists who were employed by Adam and Bute Shelburne, who were decorating the house, showed that there were actually much brighter colors than what had been represented in the room when it came in the 1940s. And so using the science and also looking at documentary evidence, archival evidence, and using scholarship, the conservators and staff here were able to determine the original color scheme of the room, and then to repaint it, to redo it, to clean it. And so there's a publication actually that came out in 1986, I think, that goes into a lot more detail if you're interested. about all of the science behind this process and some of the scholarship as well. But it was quite an involved process, and it kind of, I think, a shock to some people to really kind of see, because, you know, for a very long time, for many decades, you know, visitors and also, you know, the museum staff had kind of been used to seeing this room with the kind of more subdued, neutral colors. So that's a bit about that process.
Thank you. And I'm looking at time. Linnea, do we have time for one more question?
I think one more question would be great.
Excellent. I see a question here that's kind of interesting. I'm kind of interested in this too. Other mansions located in Berkeley Square, sort of, what else is kind of around the original house? Do you have a sense?
I mean, on the map, I mean, obviously it's close to Buckingham Palace, so that's kind of the first thing that jumped into my mind.
Well, in the 1860s, actually, there wasn't too much originally when Lord Bute purchased the land. But there were a number of other stately homes, I think, in the 18th century. So the kind of most notable one was the home for the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, which also, I believe, had a bit of a garden or a bit of space around it. And there were a few other homes like that. You can see, if we go to the first slide there, that has the modern map. You can see some of the buildings and establishments now that are around that area, including St. James's Palace is nearby, Portman Mason, which I love, is nearby. Also, as Tara mentioned, Harry Gordon Selfridge, rented Lansdowne House for all of the 20s, and his store, Selfridge's, is not too far away. It's on kind of the other side of Berkeley Square. So there are a number of high-end shops and historic homes nearby, but
and certainly by the 20th century, this is the fashionable neighborhood to be in.
Yes.
So that's why Selfridge wanted to be there.
Yes, exactly. And there's actually, with Selfridge, it's actually quite funny. There's a great sort of cartoon showing him when he first arrives in London, depicting him as kind of an uncultured American who really doesn't know his way around, and it's showing him walking through the halls of Lansdowne House, kind of admiring, the walls and the art collection. But he wanted to be in Lansdowne because it was really the place to be. It was, you were mentioning that Winston Churchill, who was around in the 1790s, remembered. Oh, sorry, yeah, 1890s, wrong century. He remembered, the kind of socializing and dining, and the kind of gaiety that was happening. So Lansdowne House always had, kind of important politicians and cultural leaders, artists, writers that were coming to visit, and it was close to the royal family. It was close to Buckingham Palace, so it really was this special place in the heart of London.
Thank you both for sharing all of your knowledge with all of us today. I've seen in the chat, in the Q&A, that people have really enjoyed it. So again, thank you to Alisa and Tara. Thank you also to Frank and Greg, who are live in the room with you both and making this happen. And of course, thank you all who are joining us. We're grateful to continue to share the virtual space with you. We hope you'll come visit the Lansdowne House drawing room and other parts of the collection in the near future. We will be sending a link to this recording, so you can look back at everything we talked about. That email will go out tomorrow, probably, so you can look out for that. We will include subtitles, and thank you all for your patience as we navigated some audio difficulties. This is our first time live streaming from the gallery. On that note, when the webinar ends, a survey will pop up in your browser. If you do have feedback for us about future programs you'd like to see, about how today's program went, we'd appreciate it very much. With that, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.